The BRICS countries just set up their own currency to compete with the United States dollar for global hegemony. And everybody is talking about how the world is de-dollarizing.
China is now trying to replace the U.S. dollar with their currency in global trade.
Obviously, the BRICS nations and China are not the only nations to explore using alternatives to the U.S. dollar.
This has many people predicting the death of the dollar. In fact, one expert in particular just bet $1 million that the United States would go into hyperinflation in the next 90 days. So this begs the question, is the dollar doomed? I'm going to reveal the answer to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over why everyone is saying the dollar is on a rapid decline: de-dollarization and money printing. Let's start by going outside the United States, and I want to point out that the global GDP right now is around $104 trillion. About 60 to 65% of those transactions are settled in USD. So called about 65 trillion. And the argument is that all these entities outside the US that are holding dollars on their balance sheet no longer need them because of all these trade agreements between countries like Saudi Arabia, China, India, Brazil, etc. So the concept is very easy to understand. Let's insert 2 whiteboard characters here. First, it's not the average Joe, but it is the average Joe's 2 cousins. In fact, he's got a lot of cousins, but these are just 2 of them. Number 1, it's the average Muhammad in the Middle East. And the average Joe in China. So the average Muhammad has all this oil. Joe's got a lot of dollars. And right now, the oil is priced in dollars. So those dollars go right over here to Muhammad. That's why he's holding a bag full of them. And this oil goes right over to Joe so he can use the energy to produce a lot of stuff. So what happens if Muhammad starts pricing his oil in yuan? Well, first and foremost, he's got yuan now going onto his balance sheet instead of those dollars, and he most likely has less need for dollars moving forward. So he's going to take the dollars that are on his balance sheet and say, well, shoot, let's go ahead and buy something that's not going to lose value. So I'm going to go ahead and send those dollars, that bag of dollars he's going to put on a plane, go right back to the United States, and he's going to buy assets such as real estate. Doesn't want those treasuries anymore because he's afraid of the dollar losing value just like everybody else. His other option is to take those dollars and buy something that he wants, such as yuan, such as the Indian rupee, maybe the Russian ruble, or this currency that is created by the BRICS countries themselves. So that means more dollars circulating in the global economy. Higher supply, less demand, means the value of those dollars plummets. Oh, but wait, there is more. The argument not only pertains to what's happening outside the United States, but also inside, domestically. So in the United States, we've got the Federal Reserve right here at the top. This blue thing, square with Florida at the end, is obviously my rendition of the United States. But what is happening is the Fed is just going to go ahead and print massive amounts of money. The government is going to run huge deficits to continue to give stimmy checks and UBI to the average Joe. We're going to have all these banks continue to go bust, and the Fed is going to bail them out. How? By printing money and printing more money. We're going to have these businesses go bust because we're going into a recession. And what is the Fed going to do? What's the government going to do? The central planners, you guessed it, they're going to continue to print more and more money. So you're going to have all these currency units denominated in dollars. They're just flooding the system. While at the same time, outside of the United States, the demand for those dollars is plummeting. And this is how you go straight into a mode of severe inflation, if not hyperinflation. And this is why so many people are concerned that the dollar is going to lose reserve status. But before we move on, I want to point out some very crucial questions that you should be asking yourself as you think this through. Number one, when we say the dollar is doomed, or you hear this on Twitter, the mainstream media, you have to ask yourself, okay, is this the dollar compared to other fiat currencies? Or is this the dollar against domestic goods and services? Or are they just saying that the dollar is going to lose reserve status? Because the answer to these questions and the set of probabilities is extremely different. Let me give you an example of what I'm referring to. In 2021 and then into 2022, we saw the dollar go up significantly on the DXY. This is a measurement of the value of the dollar relative to other currencies. While at the exact same time, we saw the inflation rate in the United States skyrocket up to over 9%. So if we have high consumer price inflation, that means the dollar is losing value against goods and services, while at the same time it is gaining value against other fiat currencies. Now let me go ahead and ask you a question, everyone that's watching this video. How many of you are saying to yourself, okay, George, I've watched a lot of your videos, and I don't know, this explanation, I get it, but compared to everything else you do, it just seems very, oversimplified. You would be correct. See, what I'm doing here is I'm just explaining to you the rationale and the ideas you are hearing in the mainstream media, on social media, and by quote-unquote experts like this guy with a B on his baseball hat. We'll call him overly basic Balaji. It's just holding a sign that says, money printer, go burn. That's all you need to know, because that's why we're going to have hyperinflation. My views are a little more nuanced. And if you really want to understand the probability of the dollar being doomed, I think your views should be more nuanced as well. And that's what we're going to discuss throughout the rest of this video. Step number 2. As always, the devil is in the details. Here's what I think the overly basic Balaji types are missing. Let's start by looking at the world's balance sheet in aggregate total. So if you took the balance sheets of all the entities in the world, put them together, how many dollars would you have? Going back to step number 1, we know global GDP about 104 trillion. And we know about 65 trillion settled in dollars. Now, there's a lot more dollars on balance sheets of these entities in aggregate total that aren't going into that GDP number. So for the sake of this video, let's assume there's about $100 trillion on the aggregate balance sheet of the entire world. All right, well, let's think this through. It's not just that there's $100 trillion that can come flooding back into the United States. That's a very myopic view if we're just looking at the asset side. We also have to look at the liability side of the balance sheet. So how were these dollars created? Well, most likely, the majority of them were created by banks lending them into existence. So if we've got $100 trillion on the asset side, guess what we've got on the liability side? $100 trillion of debt that's due in the form of loans, plus the amount of interest. So just to keep things simple, let's assume for a moment that principal plus interest, meaning when you take current liabilities plus future liabilities, equals about $150 trillion to match up against that $100 trillion of assets to pay off that current and future debt. So now let's go back to the average Joe's cousin, average Muhammad. And remember, in step number 1, he took some of his dollars, or maybe all of his dollars that he's got in that big bag, and he said, I want to buy U.S. assets. So all those dollars are flooding back into the United States. Okay, well, what would that do to the aggregate balance sheet of the world? Nothing. Because those dollars are just going from one person's balance sheet or one entity's balance sheet to another. Now, it is true that if he bought real estate that had debt against it, then that debt would most likely be paid down. So this side, the liability side of the world's balance sheet, would decrease. But what would happen to the asset side? Well, as far as the amount of dollars, that would decrease because that would be replaced by that new building or house or whatever Muhammad decided to purchase. In other words, the amount of outstanding dollars compared to the ratio of outstanding principal of that dollar-denominated debt wouldn't change at all. Okay, fine. Let's say Muhammad decides not to buy any U.S. assets. So he wants to just dump those dollars on the market. Okay, well, what would happen to the global balance sheet? Wouldn't change at all, because those dollars would go from Muhammad's account to someone else's account, but the amount of dollar-denominated debt would, once again, remain the exact same. So now, well, what happens if all these people with dollars just decide to default on their debt? They're not paying back these debts. This is just old school thinking. We're just going to take these dollars and just buy stuff and just tell those stupid bankers to pound sand. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and pull on that thread. So right here, you'll notice I've got a balance sheet, but I've actually got it switched. Instead of assets on the left, liabilities on the right, which is what I usually do, I've got the liabilities on the left and assets on the right. So why did I do this? Because we have to remember that Muhammad's dollar assets are a bank's liability. So if everyone decides to default, then all these banks, the asset side of their balance sheet would blow up. And that means they all go bust. Okay, but the world's dollar assets are a liability of the global banks. So if they all go bust, what happens to the dollar assets? Poof, they disappear. Now, I know a lot of you right now are saying, whoa, George, time out. It makes it seem what you're saying is that it's impossible for the dollar to lose value, or it's impossible for there to be more currency units than the outstanding debt. And that is not what I'm saying. Let's go over to this side of the board. So how can the money supply go up, or the supply of currency units denominated in dollars? Well, we talked about one way, and that's the banks lending those dollars into existence. But there are two other ways. Good old-fashioned, call it money printing, where let's just say the Treasury or the Fed comes out and prints 10 trillion green pieces of paper. All right, well, those weren't lent into existence, so that would definitely change this ratio. And the third way is if a bank buys from a non-bank. And you notice I'm saying bank and not the Federal Reserve, because everyone knows with quantitative easing, if they're buying those treasuries or mortgage-backed securities from a non-bank entity, that is going to increase M2. We saw a perfect example of this in 2020 and into 2021. But it's not just the Federal Reserve. If JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo buys a treasury from the average Joe, that's also going to increase M2 money supply. And now is when the overly basic Balaji types step in and say, see, George, there you go. All your stupid detail and macroeconomics, and you think you're so cool with understanding the global monetary system. None of that matters, because the Fed is just going to do so much QE that it's going to flood the system with currency units in dollars. And that's why we're going to have hyperinflation in the next 90 days. Okay? Fair point. This gives us an opportunity to do a quick thought experiment. Let's just say that Jerome Powell gets together with Janet Yellen and they say, we are going to print up $10 trillion worth of green pieces of paper. We're going to borrow Ben Bernanke's helicopter and we're going to fly right across the United States and drop all 10 trillion of those currency units. what would happen? Well, as most of you can guess, inflation in the United States would skyrocket. I don't know if we go into hyperinflation, but we would have some massive, massive amounts of consumer price inflation. And the argument would be, well, there you go. George, the dollar is going to lose value. It's going to tank on the DXY. It's no longer going to be the global reserve currency. Okay, but how would those dollars get outside of the United States to service the $150 trillion, we'll call it, of dollar-denominated liabilities? Well, the easiest way for those dollars to get outside the United States is if the US was running a huge trade deficit, which we know they are. So let's just assume for a moment that it's $100 billion a month. That's $1.2 trillion a year. So that means $1.2 trillion of those currency units are getting out into the global economy. So how big of an impact do you think that would have? Probably not much. And then you may say, okay, George, well, all the US banks are now going to be flushed with deposits, currency units, that they can lend to other entities outside of the United States in the global economy, and that's going to increase M2 money supply. Okay, well, but it's also going to increase the liability side of the balance sheet of those entities that are borrowing the dollars. We go right back to where we were in the first place. And let's not forget, you guys know from watching my videos, the yield curve has been predicting a global recession. Okay, well, if we have a global recession, what does that do to the velocity of currency units that are circulating? We go from high velocity all the way down to low velocity. And if we have lower velocity, that means it's harder for those entities to pay back this debt. So you could imagine a scenario where even if 1.2 trillion additional currency units are getting outside of the United States, that might not even be enough to satisfy the global demand for dollars to pay back that dollar-denominated debt. But right about now, overly basic Balaji steps in again and says, George, you are forgetting that the BRICS are starting their own currency. And therefore, they're not going to want to hold these dollars on their balance sheet. So they're just going to go ahead and pay off all this existing debt, and then none of this will even matter. Okay, fine. Well, let's do some math here. So let's say that all the entities, the average Muhammads, paid off 100% of their dollar debt. All right, well, then that means this number goes from 100 trillion down to zero. And let's just assume for a moment that they were able to pay off the principal plus interest. Okay, fine. So that number goes down to zero. And for those of you wondering, if velocity is high enough, you can pay back 150 trillion worth of debt, principal plus interest, with $100 trillion. I'll go ahead and save that for another video. But let's just assume that the bank's balance sheet in aggregate total now has $0 on it. No dollar-denominated debt, no dollar-denominated assets. All right, fine, but there's still going to be some demand for dollars in the global economy. So what is that going to do to the value of the dollar relative to other fiat currencies outside of the United States? That would actually be a tailwind for the dollar, not a headwind. Step number 3. So what are my predictions regarding the dollar? Remember, we've got to break this down into 3 separate buckets: the dollar versus fiat currency, the dollar versus goods and services in the United States, and the dollar losing reserve currency status. So regarding the dollar versus fiat, we'll go ahead and use the DXY as a proxy. I think that the dollar could go down in the short term or maybe in the long term, but I don't think it's going to get down to the levels that we saw in 2011, 2012, say 70 or 75. There are no certainties, only probabilities, but that's my base case. Now, on the flip side, I think the dollar could go much, much higher. I think it could go higher than any level we have ever seen on the DXY. It's really just a matter of timing because there's just thousands and thousands of variables that go into this. As an example, interest rate differentials. If the Fed lowers rates, let's say they drop them down to 0 in the next 2 months, and the ECB continues to tighten, or maybe the Bank of Japan, then you're going to see the dollar go down and go down in a hurry. But it's not going to go down to 20 or 30 on the DXY. That may mean it just drops down maybe into the 90s or into the 80s, a level that we have seen many, 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 many times before. Now let's go ahead and move on to the dollar versus goods and services in the United States. And we know that's completely separate from looking at the dollar against other fiat currencies. So when it comes to the inflation rate, or the CPI in the United States, I'm someone that believes the 2020s is going to be an inflationary decade, just like the 1970s, or maybe more specifically, just like the 1940s. And in the 1940s, inflation got as high as 19% and as low as -2. In other words, 2% deflation. And I think we'll see similar types of numbers throughout the rest of the 2020s. So what about the dollar losing reserve currency status? What you're seeing right now with this global push towards de-dollarization definitely illustrates how the US dollar is losing reserve currency status. But just like we saw in the 1920s, when the transition from the British pound to the US dollar actually started, it wasn't finalized until Bretton Woods in 1944. So my point is these things take a long time. They take decades. They don't happen in days, weeks, or years. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.